Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr. and Hugh Hefner. Tonight, the Playboy philosophy.
Hugh Hefner is widely known as the founder, editor, and publisher of Playboy magazine and the entrepreneur of related enterprises, among them the Playboy clubs, which are designed simultaneously to stimulate all the senses. Mr. Hefner's magazine is most widely known for its total exposure of the human female, though of course other things happen in its pages. But Mr. Hefner insists that it is a great deal more. There is such a thing as a Playboy philosophy, of which he is the prophet, and that philosophy is destined to liberate us all from what he variously calls superstition, fury, tyranny, moral absolutism, that kind of thing. The philosophy made its debut approximately 4 years ago, and to the surprise of everyone and the horror of some, still continues chapter after chapter, issue after issue, vouchsafing to the world the philosophy of Mr. Hugh Hefner. Although Mr. Hefner deals with a number of subjects, once again, it is his views on sex that are especially controversial and especially observed. I should like to ask him, just to begin with, whether he rejects conventional Judeo-Christian codes of sexual behavior. Mr. Hefner?
Yes, at the essence of them, I think I do. The philosophy, really, I think, is an anti-Puritanism, a response, really, to the Puritan part of our culture. So, to that extent, sex, I think, is part of the Judeo-Christian ethic that kind of got lost, and is the part that is restrictive and not truly, I think, naturalistic.
Well, the Judeo-Christian code obviously, as we know, antedated Puritanism, didn't it?
Yes, it covers a lot of ground.
I'm not talking about whether or not you reject Cotton Mather's accretions on the Mosaic Law, but whether you reject the Mosaic Law. Do you reject, for instance, monogamy? Do you reject the notion of sexual continence before marriage? Yourself, that is to say, you as a philosopher of the new ideal of sexual liberation.
Well, I think what it really comes down to is an attempt to establish a, what's been called a new morality, and I really think that's what the American, this thing called the American Sexual Revolution is really all about. It's an attempt to replace the old legalism. It's certainly not a rejection of monogamy as such, but very much an attempt, in the case of premarital sex, there really hasn't been any moral code in the past except simply a thou shalt not. And
well, that's a code, isn't it?
Well, perhaps. I don't think it's a very realistic one.
Well,
gentlemen, may we continue in just a moment after this brief interruption.
Well, Mr. Hefner, if you do in fact reject what is commonly known as the Christian code or the religious code, why do you take the position that the Playboy philosophy is really, in a sense, non-controversial, that it is sort of congruent with the new reality? If in fact you have rewritten the ancient theological tablets, oughtn't you to claim some kind of a moral authority to do so? And if so, what is that moral authority? Is it only your own intuition, or what is it?
Well, first of all, I don't think that just related to sex, just that part of the philosophy, this is not really a rejection in any real sense of the total Christian ethic related to sex. It's an attempt to reevaluate some of the social sexual ills of our time, and I think that what's going on in society at this particular time, this quest for a new morality, is something that we're only, one small voice in. And it's really an attempt to supply a 20th century code. Although I dislike the word code because I think the old legalism is part of the problem. I think that hopefully we're going to evolve a more what's been called situation ethics, an approach to ethical problems where sex is concerned, not unlike the approach that we use where other problems are concerned. In no other area of morality, I don't think, is it as cut and dried that you follow a certain law simply to follow that law, even if it sometimes takes you out the window. In the case of premarital sex, I think you've got the prime example of this.
How so?
Well, we've taken the attitude traditionally, and this certainly didn't begin, it's not Christian in the sense that it came from Christ per se, but it's something that grew through the organization and historical, the anti-sexual aspect of the Christian ethic grew through the centuries and became especially extreme in the Puritan and Victorian thing that we suffer from here in America. And it's a rejection of the notion that sex can have any real place, any moral place prior to marriage. And I don't think this is really, I don't think it's logical. I think we know a great deal more about the psychosexual nature of man now that indicates that it's not logical. I don't think it's truly to the best interest of people, and I don't think it's truly moral, in the sense that we would apply the word moral or ethical in any other area of activity.
I'm simply suggesting that it is rather unusual to see you, as you describe your philosophy, express a sense of shock that moral exegetes during the preceding 2,000 years should have had the nerve to disagree with you. It is, I think, important for the record to establish that you are seeking, in effect, to annul the traditional code about what is proper sexual behavior. But let me ask you this.
I'm suggesting that it be re-examined. You suggested that two or three times, or stated to it. It's not true that I'm, by any sense, because the end that I'm seeking is really very similar. I think that we are more apt to have a truly monogamous society if we do more realistically come to grips with some of these problems. I think that we've avoided the problems with some of these old rules that have simply been there and ignored much of the time.
Well, but do you, as a matter of fact, tend to take the position in which you would not be unique, that any moral laws that don't, in fact, reflect human behavior are themselves philosophically suspect? That is to say, I know that, for instance, you cite Kinsey with extraordinary enthusiasm, as though he had, in fact, liberated your thinking on the matter. And you say, well, look, here Kinsey observes that the typical human male and the typical human female are sexually promiscuous, and under the circumstances, we ought to reverse our laws and our public attitudes in order to make permissible and perhaps even admirable that which, in fact, happens. Are you a positivist in this sense?
I think that only becomes part of it. I don't think that it follows per se that simply because a thing is done, even done by a majority of people, that it is necessarily the best and moral thing. But I think that when you are involved with or are concerned with a natural physical drive and something as basic to the nature of man as sex is, that when you do get scientific evidence, as Kinsey has supplied, that indicates the great disparity. This, to me, is the value of Kinsey, indicated for the first time statistically the great disparity that existed between our professed beliefs and the actual actions of society. I don't think it follows, therefore, per se, that what has been revealed as what is occurring is necessarily moral, but as one good reason for questioning some of the old morality. I think that the reasons are a good deal deeper than that. The real reasons are that many of these moral views are not good for people. That good, just, humane ends do not come from these old traditions. And I think that premarital sex, since that's what we're talking about here at the moment, premarital sex can be moral or immoral, just as marital sex can.
Well, now, but what qualifies you to advance this position? It is, of course, a position which happens to be, again, highly congruent with a highly saleable philosophy Your magazine has a lot of readers and is considered sort of exciting in virtue of its sexual iconoclasm. But it does seem to me that the background of people who have taken it on themselves to reverse ancient attitudes about very sacred matters has been one of a lifetime of study and a certain amount of moral agony given over to these questions. But Playboy all of a sudden simply announces that thanks in part to it, we simply have to repeal these ancient attitudes. And I have seen in your own Playboy philosophy no other justification for it than that people ought not to be afflicted with a tormented conscience simply because they give way to their sexual libidos, irrespective of the consequences. Now, that is really, in effect, your position, i.e., isn't it?
No, not at all.
It's sort of a hedonistic utilitarianism under
Well,
John Stuart Mill.
The philosophy, this editorial series that we've been involved in, has been, if it's been criticized for one single thing, it has been its verbosity, and much of that has been due to the fact that we've quoted at great length a great many sources. I think that scientific, religious, practical, and philosophical, related to these questions. It seems to me that what you're really saying is, what right have I to express what are admittedly only my own particular evaluations of the situation? And it seems to me that that's what a free society is all about.
No, I recognize you're right, and I specifically conceded it a moment ago under the Constitution of the United States. Say anything you want at all. What I'm here to question is your credentials as a serious moral teacher. And it seems to me, though, that the flavor of your protracted sermon in Playboy is simply to speak about those who disagree with you as old, crotchety Puritans who unfortunately don't share your sense of enlightenment. In connection with what you said, and I think it bears very, very directly on your point, you say that the Kinsey report revealed a considerable disparity between what actually goes on and what people suppose goes on. Why do you say that? That is to say, to whom do you suppose that the Kinsey report came as a great surprise? Can you imagine for instance, a Catholic confessor who would have been surprised by the Kinsey report?
No,
why did Christ refer to his disposition to forgive a sinner 70 times 7 times unless he anticipated the possibility of 490 sins?
I think it came as a great surprise to the general public. No, I don't think it came as a surprise to people who are deeply involved in this kind of problem, whether on the religious side or on the social or psychological side. But for the general public, the revelations in the report, I think, were very much an eye-opener. But more than that, they brought them out into the public print. And this, again, I think, is where Playboy is, and the philosophy are really important. It is not, I don't think that any particular, although I agree that many aspects of the philosophy are, in one sense, controversial, in that these are the things that, these social questions are the things that are being debated in society today. The philosophy is not really putting forth a unique or original point of view. Mm-hmm. The major thing I think that we're in a position to do, and happily so from my own point of view, is to permit the exchange of views on these things and to probe into some of the questions that do not find a general airing in the popular press. And I think this is one of the problems that we've suffered from in the past, related to sex and some other questions too.
Well, I don't deny that you occasionally ambush a dissenter into writing in your columns so as to be slapped down by your very skillful editors. But there is a Playboy line.
Very much so. Very
and
much so.
That Playboy line is a line that, for instance, refers to the, quotes, bugaboo of sin, refers to, quotes, sacred cows. And as I understand it, the bugaboo of sin is your reference to those theological sanctions that attempt to restrain certain people from giving way to lustful anxieties on the grounds that to do so is wrong. What I don't understand is what I wish you would explain to me is why you simply brush aside the very concept of wrong and right. Why you feel that that they are highly irrelevant, provided you have, as you so frequently put it, two consenting adults.
What I attack is the notion that right and wrong should be related simply to the notion of sin, simply to a notion of thou shalt not, rather than related to the real ultimate interests of the human beings involved. That's what the philosophy is all about.
But do you suppose that the people who wrote the Bible, some people even allege that they were divinely inspired, or against the ultimate interests of people?
Are you
going to die a happier man than St. Francis of Assisi as a result of your pursuit of hedonism?
Basic sexual ethic is really based upon the Bible per se. It's much more complex than that, and became, much more restrictive than that.
Well, I would find it a much easier geographical act to trace a line between Puritanism and the Bible than between the Playboy philosophy and the Bible.
Yes, I think that's right.
Although I agree with you that there are certain accretions which have never been acknowledged by all theological thinkers, but all theological Christians, theologically trained thinkers, take the position that simply because somebody desires to do something doesn't necessarily make it right. But I don't understand you to be taking this position.
I think we're overlooking a very important key in this thing. One of the basic things that we have argued against is the notion that in our particular concept of a free society, with the emphasis that is placed in America on the separation of church and state, that the notion of sin, or predicating these social sexual taboos on any kind of religious concept, that this is not a proper approach in a society in which that is supposed to be pluralistic and supposed to be secular. It doesn't mean that each particular religious denomination can't come up with their own particular evaluation of sin as they see it, but I don't think that sin should have any particular place in secular society as such, because it's a religious concept and should remain that.
Gentlemen, we'll pursue this point further after this brief interruption.
It seems to me, Mr. Haffner, that your position begs a couple of facts of life. I know you're interested in facts of life. One of them is that man being religiously oriented, a society tends to have certain religious commitments which may be extremely necessary, in fact indispensable, to the ethos of that society, whatever the particular arrangements are as regards the actual division of the authority between church and state, so that I think it is possible to say that there never was a completely atheistic state, at least not one this side of tyranny. But the second, even accepting your premise, is surely this, that in your emphasis on the private moral authority of the individual, you cease to take into account, do you not, that man's sexual activity, if it is normal, is not a masturbatory matter. It is something that involves other individuals, and that in the course of that relationship, all of society has a certain vested interest in the nature of that relationship, and that under the circumstances, it is not, as you put it somewhere here, when you said a man's morality, like his religion, is a personal affair best left to his own conscience. Surely it isn't personal if it involves somebody else, if it involves children, if it involves his neighbors, if it involves his whole relationship to the community.
You've raised two kinds of questions. There are two separate questions. I think that obviously you do need in any society, and there has always been, an underlying ethical or moral set of values that is society-wide. But I think that it would be dismissing too lightly the thing that is distinctly unique to, or was in the beginning, to the American concept of democracy. This this notion of separating church and state was a rather, radical kind of concept when it was conceived, and a great many people didn't think it was going to work.
As a matter of fact, it was never conceived in America.
No, it wasn't
9 out of the
conceived there, but
13
it's the
states had established religions. So
Yes.
the idea of the kind of division you're talking about was a discovery of Earl Warren of about 7 or 8 years ago.
No, the kind of concept I'm talking about is something that you'll find in the Constitution, and it wasn't in the first 13 colonies, but it was indeed incorporated into the basic concept of America. And this wall of separation that they talk about, not excluding religion per se, or religious morality is what we're really talking about here, but recognizing that traditionally, historically, in the old world, this was the key to much of the chaos and the etc.
Let's not talk about the entire of separation of church and
Okay,
state. To a
but let's
certain
get
extent,
into that.
I agree with you. What I am challenging is a notion that religion ought not to inform the values of a citizen.
That, after all, is a completely different thing than what we're talking about.
Well, but not different from what Playboy philosophy is engaged in making fun of every religious notion, however it is translated, whether through the laws or through the teachings of our venerable ancestors. If anybody who disagrees with you is just plain wrong. He's superstitious. He's purely tyrannical, one of your terms. And I'm asking you whether or not you agree with the proposition that whatever the agreements are between church and state, in point of fact, the so-called freedom of the church, as outlined and explained and defended even by people who desire to keep the church and state separate, Father Murray, for instance, quoted by you frequently as a case in point, that precisely that freedom of the church is to inform the people about the necessity to maintain certain values that conduce to a viable existence, and you're engaged in breaking those values, at least as far as sexuality
Needless
is
to
concerned.
say, I have no reservation to the free exchange of various points of view relative to this or any other question, coming from religious quarters or any other. And it would be very easy for the viewers here perhaps to get the mistaken notion also that the basic things that Playboy puts forth are per se on one side of the disagreement here, and that the religious community is on the other side. This too is not true. This thing called a sexual revolution, which is really what we're talking about here, is something that is going on in both secular and religious religious community, and is something in which a great many more liberal members of the clergy are very deeply involved in and concerned about. I think this search for a new ethical, set of moral values based on something other than simply rigid rules set forth many, many centuries ago is something from which only good can come.
I have no doubt that you are simultaneously in pursuit of good and a high circulation for Playboy magazine, and that you consider the two to be common goals. And I have no doubt either that today, as 1,000 years ago, you're going to find divines who are perfectly prepared to agree with you that we ought to have a completely, quote, sex-liberated society. I myself tend to be a little bit orthodox, at least as regards this. I understand the Christian tradition to be one that says merely because you have an appetite is not an excuse for giving in to it. And I understand the Playboy philosophy to be saying it is to lead to a kind of a neurotic repression to ask somebody to give it. Incidentally,
Freud said that.
Yeah. Mm.
Freud said that.
Well, no, he didn't say quite exactly that.
Well, I see one of the things I think that's very important.
In the first place, he was a very orthodox monogamist.
All right, I think that we're more apt to get...
What Freud said was understand what it is that you're doing to yourself.
We are more apt
but
to get...
he was not a latitudinarian as regards personal behavior.
We are more apt to get true monogamy, happy monogamy, something other than the sequential polygamy that we really have in society today, I think if we take a more realistic...
If I may say so, how in the hell do you know? How do you know?
Well, all you can do is base upon, it seems to me, the facts that exist as we know them today, which are considerably different than those that existed many centuries ago. We do have Freud. We do have some, as in many other areas of man's advancement, there have been significant technological advances just within the last few years. The pill, the scientific, though not the actual, solution to the problem of venereal disease, these two great bugaboos in the past that lent some seeming logic to the simple thou shalt nots, now technologically have been solved. We haven't been able to apply them socially yet, but it seems to me that it does begin to permit the opportunity of examining sex in a new concept that is not totally related to procreation, is not...
But isn't this analogous to saying that since the discovery of insurance policies, it's perfectly all right to rob?
No, I think it's comparable to saying
the principal fact of robbery is the deprivation, which deprivation no longer is meaningful if you have an insurance policy.
Do I understand you to say that you're relating sex to robbery? Is that what you're saying?
I am suggesting that there is a sanction both against, quote, illicit sex and robbery. Incidentally...
Illicit sex, after all, is only what we call illicit sex.
Correct,
I mean, is all premarital sex illicit sex?
And I suppose the question before the House is whether God also calls it illicit sex, assuming that you acknowledge its existence. But here is something that has always rather struck me as paradoxical in your behavior. Here is your magazine, in effect encouraging pre-sexual, premarital licentiousness, and as a matter of fact, postmarital licentiousness. But you give very, very strict orders to your bunnies in the Playboy clubs that they must under no circumstances consort sexually with their patrons. Now, why do you do this? Why mightn't this stultify them? Might this inconvenience the patrons? Aren't you being a little bit inconsistent and being
very consistent, I think.
Rigid?
No, it's kind of a notion. You see, you suggest that what I really have is a kind of a view of society in which there are no rules, personal or otherwise. And of course, this is not the kind of thing that I have in mind at all. Any kind of freedom requires greater personal responsibility, but where the clubs are concerned, this is simply a matter of not feeling that it's necessary to mix sex and the commercial.
Oh, why not?
In other words, the clubs are there for a specific purpose, and that's the specific purpose.
Assuming it were legal to do so, would you set up a series of brothels around the country?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that...
in what way would this be inconsistent with the Playboy philosophy?
It wouldn't be inconsistent, it's just not my cup of tea.
Why? Is it not profitable enough?
No, I just am motivated by other things, that's all.
No, but I really am interested in this because I take seriously the attempt to understand the Playboy philosophy, and I don't understand why, on the one hand, you should urge this kind of latitudinarianism, and on the other hand, in certain other aspects of your commercial life, be rather a martinet on the subject. I don't understand why you give one series of instructions to your readers and another to your bunnies in New York City and Chicago.
Well, we don't give any instructions to the bunnies in terms of their personal life. That's the point. In other words, this is not their personal life. This is a specific operation set there for a specific purpose. And has nothing to do with whatever
wait a minute, as I understand it, because I've read your code of behavior for the bunnies, and as I understand it, they're not permitted to go home with patrons even after they are off duty. Isn't that correct?
All that this requires, and really the motivation behind it, is really a protection for the girls themselves. It permits us to...
Protection against what?
Against the infinite variety of ways that they would have to find to decline pleasantly if they wanted to decline pleasantly. That's the point. In other words, it simply separates the one from the other. And I see no inconsistency of any kind. To me, to be consistent the other way, it would mean that an analogy that I've used before, that Ziegfeld, because he put beautiful girls on a stage that were inviting and delightful as a part of his show, would be obliged to supply them with the orange drink during the intermission. I think that the two are, the one does not follow logically from the other.
Gentlemen, may we continue in just a moment? We would like to interrupt briefly.
Mr. Hafner, it seems to me that precisely what, quote, follows is directly in point. That is to say, if a careful reader of the Playboy philosophy emerges, as, for instance, I myself did on reading it, with the notion that there ought not to be any restraints on one's, quote, normal appetites, then precisely what follows is at what point does it all of a sudden become pertinent to suggest certain restraints. And it seems to me that you run into this difficulty with this paradoxical advice, as I said a moment ago, that you give on the one hand to your readers and on the other hand to your buddies who are in a position to gratify those restraints. Now, we see as recently as a couple of weeks ago a position that might be a part of your 100th installment of your Playboy philosophy. Here's an ad in the most distinguished literary weekly, or rather fortnightly, published in New York City for a book called A Bill of Rights for Erotic Liberation of the Sexually Different. And their point really being, I suppose, that there's no reason at all for you arbitrarily to decide what's normal and what's abnormal. In point of fact, you have gone rather far yourself in suggesting that that which has from time to time been considered abnormal in sexual life is really oughtn't to be so. It should be completely normal. So this Swedish doctor publishes a book in which he suggests that convenient provisions ought to be made for the sex as the object of their passion. The idea being that presumably it's a social responsibility to accommodate their tastes. Now, who says A, as somebody says, must say B? And what I don't find anywhere in your sexual philosophy is the point at which you say, look, even though this is what you would like to do, don't. And the reason you oughtn't is something that doesn't attach merely or doesn't consult merely your personal pleasures of the moment, but certain strategic ethical notions. Where is this in the Playboy philosophy? Why doesn't B follow from A?
Well, I think that B does follow A, but it follows, I think it seems to me, in this way. One, we've emphasized very much relative to sex and everything else in the philosophy that man is and should be responsible for his actions. The freedom is not something that removes restraints per se, but the very implications of a free society, and this is so obvious to us in every other way, it's just that sex has gotten lost in it, does require personal responsibilities, and man is and should be accountable for his acts. Now, where sexual deviation is concerned, I think that a very important, valid point can be made. Sexual deviation, as such, is perpetuated by the kind of suppressive attitude on sex that we've traditionally had in society. One of the things that we're strongly opposed to. Dr. Gebhardt recently at the Sex Institute at Indiana University was asked whether he felt that there would ever be a significant decline in homosexuality in America. And he said, not until we're willing to put far more emphasis on the heterosexual than we are today. Society itself and the kind of conditions that it places around sex very much determines the direction that the normal, or that the innate sex drive is going to take in people. And you can either have a society that emphasizes, that has a more permissive emphasis on the heterosexual and the healthy, or you can have one that is essentially restrictive, essentially suppressive, and leads to repression and results in a maximum amount of perversion, a maximum amount of frigidity and impotence, and all the other problems that go with it.
Well, no, I know that you have acknowledged, to get back to the first point you made, the, quote, responsibilities. People must take responsibility for their action. What I've never seen you do is enumerate those responsibilities. God knows it hasn't been because of a lack of space.
No, but one of the major reasons for it, I think...
what are the responsibilities? Suppose the woman feels that her life has been shattered as a result of the man's decision that he's had enough of her and wants to go on to the next interest. What are those responsibilities you talk about so often but don't enumerate? The responsibility always to take precautions against the birth of a child, always to take precautions against venereal disease. What are the responsibilities to people, to women? You know, you've been accused by, for instance, Professor DeMott of reducing, quotes, the whole man to his private parts.
Yes.
And accused by Professor Harvey Cox of really being anti-sexual in the sense that a woman is simply an accessory.
And my reaction to that is...
Your reaction has been
I don't get to express my reaction.
Sure, go ahead.
My reaction is, of course, that female emancipation is very much related to sexual emancipation, that the two cannot be separated from one another, and that it is our traditional attitude on sex that has placed woman very much in this second-class, non-human role in which chastity has been more important than human welfare. So it is only out of this...
But surely the question is whether chastity is related to human welfare, isn't it? For instance, your notions of privacy. You rush off to say, well, look, after all, God invented the human body, and under the circumstances you find it grotesque to assume that total exposure is obscene. But what role does privacy play in your life? Is it or is it not true that your photographers ran pictures of Jane Fonda naked without her permission to do so? Or do you simply consider that her permission was absolutely irrelevant, since after all God made her the whole of her, and therefore she belongs to your readers?
No, quite the contrary. If we'd known all the circumstances involved in the... first of all, Playboy very much is involved in where nudity is concerned. A professional agreement between model and magazine, and this was we're not a confidential of the photographic world. In other words, we don't go into people's private homes, etc. In the Fonda case, this was something where she was involved in something that was directly related to her career. But indeed, in addition to that, if I had known all of the facts as they later came out, we would not have printed the pictures.
Well, do you have a contempt for Jane Fonda?
A contempt
because
for
of her refusal to exhibit her body on your
Not
pages?
at all.
Is she a victim of one of these bugaboos, one of these old...
The implication that, in other words, it'll be a very sad thing indeed if what we get out of this transitional period, because we are going through a period of moral transition related to sex, and we will not be going back to the old concepts. Now, if all we wind up with out of this is a new legalism in which thou shalt or thou must replaces thou shalt not, I agree with you, we'll be no better off. The attempt in establishing something that will be more related truly to what I consider to be really ethical or really moral will be a situation in which people are able to make these decisions situationally related to the real circumstances and related to people's real interests.
Don't you miss this point, that individuals have got to make these decisions with reference to certain norms, and you're there trying to subvert those norms, i.e., you are taking the position that those people who disagree with you are irrational, old-fashioned, atavistic, while simultaneously you say, well, under the in a free society they ought to be privileged. In effect, you say this in parentheses, to act like queers, to act like old-fashioned, I forget some of those colorful phrases that you use to describe your adversaries.
Well, I don't think all my adversaries are irrational by any means.
Well,
particularly if they start from a premise that is basically religious.
Right. Therefore, if they are not irrational, ought you to concede that there exists a rational defense of certain theories having to do with social behavior, which, however, you keep dismissing.
No,
not
epithets, secular.
These
Not secular, I don't.
The sacred cows, the bugaboos, the old-fashioned concepts of sin, and so on and so forth.
Because, again, we're talking about placing on secular society what is essentially a religious moral ethic, and that I very much oppose. I'm not opposed to the religious moral ethic, but I'm very much opposed to applying it to that part of society. I'm opposed only to applying it to the part of society that may happen to have different views,
We have
religious
only
and moral.
a couple of seconds left, but I do beg you to acknowledge this distinction. That, number one, you concede everyone's right to his religion. This I take for granted.
That's right.
But
And
you are actively engaged in trying to persuade people
to stop applying their moral
that
views.
Their religion is not equipped to equip them with the effrontery to disagree with you about what are the proper modes of sexual behavior.
These particular religious moral views have found their way into our laws, have found our way into our sexual social code.
Now, look,
it is that I'm opposed to.
You write thousands of words every month in your magazine that have nothing to do with the laws, in which you give your avuncular advice to Miss Jones and Mr. Smith, who write you about their sexual difficulties. In the course of meeting out advice, you never once ask them, that I have seen, to consult their religion or to consult what I might call expert teachers of ethics. You simply take over. And in doing so, you are not merely using your own freedom to govern your own personal life, but you are urging it to undermine the precepts which an awful lot of people hold are indispensable to the survival of community life.
What we're doing is supplying an alternate point of view to the ones that are all too prevalent in Ann Landers and in much of the rest of secular society, in those special departments like the Advisor and the Forum, where readers specifically ask us questions. This is very different than indicating that this is the only way. One of the real key to the philosophy is not offering an alternate moral code to the traditional one, but a suggestion that there may be some better answers, and that we're apt to find some better answers if we re-examine many of these old traditional ideas.
Gentlemen, we'll continue in just a moment, if we may. We'd like to interrupt briefly. Gentlemen, we have some questions which have been submitted by our viewers. We'll direct specific questions to each of you, but if you have a rejoinder or a comment or a rebuttal, please feel free to offer it. Mr. Buckley, we'll direct the first question to you. What is your first reaction to Mr. Hefner's comment that the only solution to the nuclear problem, and we quote, is to turn over all our nuclear weapons to the UN, close quote?
Well, I think it's a program for disaster, and I think that I wasn't aware that Mr. Hefner had made that particular statement.
I didn't.
But maybe he would want to modify it if he did.
Yes. The quote, that particular quote came from, I think, the piece that was done on me by the Saturday Evening Post. And what I did say, however, was not unrelated to that. It was not the UN per se, but what I said was that the only eventual possible solution to the problem of nuclear armament, it seemed to me clearly, was in some kind of world governmental control of same. Now, obviously, simply turning them over to the UN at this particular point would be impractical because the safeguards aren't there. But that there is no possible solution in the two alternatives that are offered most often in the popular press today. Neither disarmament nor a number of different countries, and increasingly a greater number, arming for the war that everyone is aware can't be fought, is any solution. And that if we're ever going to reach a point, this is one far more dramatic example than sex, where technology has outrun the social problems. We've got to find a way in which we can live together in a world other than by war and by force.
In the light of the explanation, Mr. Buckley, do you have any comment?
No, sir.
We'll direct a question to you, Mr. Hefner. Wouldn't you agree that there is a direct relationship between the decline of absolute moral standards and the consequent rise of crime and depravity, etc.?
No, not at all. I think that sex crimes come from just the opposite. I think there are more acts of... We're very aware right now of, in this last year or so, a number of acts of violence which at their heart are basically sexual. But this kind of thing comes not from a more, what I would call a more realistic evaluation of or sexual morality, but from basically suppressive attitudes. It's out of sex suppression that this kind of violence comes.
I'm assuming, Mr. Buckley, you would care to comment.
Yes, I know, and everybody knows, that it is extremely hard for criminologists to come up with any conclusive tables on the relationship between violence passively enjoyed and violence explicitly committed. However, I think that it is a matter of common sense, if that word hasn't also been anachronized, to recognize that to the extent that a society is deprived of a sense of reality having to do with what is right and what is wrong, and what is permissible and what is impermissible, a certain kind of self-indulgence is encouraged. That is to say, if you have a society in which it is universally agreed that certain kinds of activity are wrong, that in itself acts as a social and psychological deterrent. And there is no question that during the 20th century, the roots of knowledge about ethics have been considerably uprooted, and that for that reason, even though such tables as I speak of haven't been developed, there is no doubt in my mind that there is some relationship between man's exclusive pursuit of his own desires and his willingness to frustrate popular conventions about violence and sex.
Mr. Buckley, we'll direct this next question to you, sir. Hasn't the new morality, so-called, already displaced the old morality? Isn't, in effect, Mr. Hefner's new morality now the established morality?
Well, it's certainly more established than it was before. In this respect, I agree with Mr. Hefner that it is part of what they call the zeitgeist. It is part of the general solipsism of our time, part of what Dean Fitch refers to as the odyssey of the self-centered self, i.e., I count and nobody else counts under the circumstances. That which gives me a pleasure is in and of itself a venerable objective. So I do agree that the new morality is on the march. What I disagree about is that it's welcome.
Mr. Hefner, you choose to reply?
Well, I think my feeling is that we are very much involved at this particular point in a period of transition, and that the new morality may seem to apply where sex is concerned up to a certain point where, because it is far and away from having been firmly established on all levels of society, where both social and legal considerations are concerned, a young person may suddenly find himself caught up in some of the very real problems related to the traditional morality, and because he's come in conflict with them.
Well, gentlemen, we have just about run out of time for our questions from our viewers. Thank you very kindly.
Well, we have only a few seconds, Mr. Hefner, but I would like to say that I detect a contrast between your tone in explaining the Playboy philosophy here today and your tone in the magazine. Here it seems to me you're advancing it as an alternative view of human experience, whereas in your magazine, I understand you to advancing it as the only modern, intellectually responsible way of looking at things.
No, not at all. In other words, the philosophy really is just our own particular, mine essentially, and the magazine's evaluation of the social sexual ills, and an attempt to re-examine and suggesting some alternatives.
Well, thank you very much. Very nice to see you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.